Welcome to Global Ethics Review. I'm Alex Woodson from Carnegie Council, the world's catalyst for ethical action. In this podcast series, we'll be connecting Carnegie Council's work and current events with our senior fellows, senior staff, and friends of our organization. You'll hear from leading experts on artificial intelligence and technology, migration, climate change governance, and U.S. foreign policy and global engagement. In this episode, I'm speaking with Dr. Alexander Görlach. Dr. Görlach is a senior fellow at Carnegie Council, a research associate at the Oxford Internet Institute, and a senior advisor to the Berggruen Institute. He's also the author of Homo Empathicus, on scapegoats, populists, and saving democracy. This book was recently published in the United States and was the basis of our talk. We discussed the COVID-19 pandemic and politics, human rights in China, and some early impressions of the Biden administration. Here's my talk with Dr. Alexander Görlach. Alexander Görlach, great to speak with you again. I think we talked about 2 years ago, so good to have you back. We're going to be talking about your book, Homo Empathicus, on scapegoats, populists, and saving democracy. So just to start, tell us a little bit about the book. What exactly does Homo Empathicus mean, and what motivated you to write this book?
Thank you, Alex. It's a great pleasure to be here again with you and conversing about my work. Homo Empathicus, I mean, there have been like numerous reasons in the past to reflect on the nature of how we have to be to live in a good and a just society. And America has just been out of for Trump years, but we have still like many places in the world where resentment rather than empathy is driving politics, and it's also like moving people. And I felt it was about time to look at these different types of politics in order to like highlight what we have and what we have achieved in the democratic free world and what we are up against.
Great. And so this book was published, at least in Germany, before the pandemic. We've all been through a lot in the past year or so. So just thinking back about your book and what led you to write the book and some of the conclusions you came to in the book, as the pandemic started and as you look at it today, has it turned out how you imagined it might, based on these issues that you've covered in the book, or has things surprised you? What's been your overall impression of that?
The pandemic was one of the examples that you could like test the theory of the Homo Empathicus on, obviously. And we saw this quite in the beginning already, and over the course of the pandemic, at least the first half year, the comparison between the People's Republic of China, where the virus originated, and how it was coped by politics over there, which being an autocratic system, and in other parts of the world, also like in Taiwan, just like next door to China. And both these countries hold the same heritage, they speak the same language, but they have a different recent past where like China became more and more autocratic, and Taiwan for now, since the 90s, early 90s, is a democracy. But that's also been said about China and America, or Europe and China, and other autocratic and democratic countries. And some would say like, oh, if you were only an autocracy, you could just say in the morning, we just lock off a whole city and millions of people have to stay home. Frankly, we also saw we could do that in a democracy too. The only thing is like that politics who does that has to be held accountable, or is to be held accountable, and has to be explaining to people what actually the aim of this policy is. And we have seen, be it Spain or France, I mean, people are not cheering or didn't cheer about last summer when they all had to stay inside and were not even allowed to leave the house, but still people complied. So you do not need an autocracy to have good governance and effective governance.
Yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned Taiwan. About a year ago, both you and I had separate interviews with Audrey Tang, the digital minister of Taiwan. And as you said, Taiwan's a democracy. They've completely beaten back COVID-19. I haven't checked recently, but last I checked, they've barely had a pandemic. So why was Taiwan able to handle this so well? A country like the United States, the UK, maybe even Germany, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Just in speaking with Audrey Tang, just in learning about Taiwan, what do you think they were able to do that a lot of other democracies weren't?
Well, it's actually a good example, Taiwan and the United States. Last year, like the mayhem in the United States, to my opinion, and I was in New York at the time, was that the central government, the federal government, did not take any action, not have any prerogative, not take any initiative to tackle the pandemic. So there was clearly a lack of empathy, and that led to a variety of measures, also to ideologically driven measures. And I would say, okay, Taiwan is much smaller, but having lived on Taiwan, there is a high investment of the people in their civil society. And that also led to a bigger, greater eagerness to share data, to have like a unified approach to data and how the data is used. And I feel that's pretty the difference. And you can now see the United States doing much better. And now I'm abroad in Germany, and I feel that's because the central government has been taking on some initiative when it comes to vaccination. Also, there is, America has seen lots of natural disasters where you know how to cope with it. And so we have something to roll that out. But still, now we have a greater or bigger initiative by the central government. You could say now this is also empathy. I don't know, good governance is just also like a tool that you need to know how to use. But I feel like that's why Taiwan was so specifically good at it, because people are very much invested in their free society.
Yeah, and just speaking about empathy, that's been one of Joe Biden's hallmarks as he's come into office. He spoke about empathy a lot, and that seems to be driving a lot of his decisions. Is that how you see it? Looking from Germany, looking at this from a different perspective, do you think that empathy has taken a role in U.S. politics in the last couple of months?
The thing is, like, empathy as a tool of good governance or good policy has been around and discussed since the antiquities. Also the antiquities in Asia, in China, or the Greek antiquities and the Roman antiquities. So it is a tool rather than just like a soft skill. It's like, it means like you have to be able to assess what other people you share the space with, you live with, also you chose to live with, what their ideas are, where they're coming from, in order then to just figure out solutions for the questions at hand. And if you do not bother, then the opponent of this empathy is resentment. And you can literally see, like, to explain what empathy is, to look into resentment-driven societies where minorities are scapegoated for whatever, like the homosexuals in Russia or transgender people everywhere in the world, basically also in the right-wing camp in the United States, which is a replacement of real politics. You just like use your resentment in order to fuel and mobilize people, but to no end. Whereas empathy has a clear and an efficient end. It's about finding a solution. It's very constructive. So if you look into the policies in the United States, it's very interesting that under Obama, I feel more people were deported back to Mexico, to Latin America than under Trump. So you might say, oh, if it's only like a front end thing, you cannot just only talk empathy and never do it. However, you see a clear difference between the detainment of children in the Trump era and how it was discussed then in the Obama era. But Mr. Biden has actually not yet to prove that he's capable of empathy. I mean, his career speaks for itself. Also, the knowledge or the habitual knowledge of like that alliances matter. I feel that's deeply ingrained in him. But now it's also, what does it mean? Like, how, to what end do we like unify now? And he's talking about the a League of Democracy very often. And John Davenport of Fordham, I believe, did that. I also write about this in my book here, in Homo Empathicus. But then it's like, what is this supposed to mean? Because clearly from Taiwan to Canada, New Zealand to Germany, and that includes also Korea, South Korea, Japan, you name it. It's all democracies. They all rest on the same values and the acknowledgement of human dignity and human rights. And it's clearly that countries like China do not, but to what avail? And I feel here he has also to become like a leader, almost a theoretical leader, as a leader in theory, in theories, as FDR was with his 4 freedoms. So just to define an ideological like background on which these policies, the League of Democracies will conduct.
Yeah, it's going to be very interesting to see how that plays out. Just going back to the pandemic, I'm just interested. So as you said, you were in New York at the beginning of the pandemic. I believe you were in Queens, right? Yeah. Same as me. And yeah, as you said, it was just a terrible time, very chaotic. Yeah, I mean, at a certain point you came to Germany, right? What did you, we were talking a little bit before we started recording, but what did you notice in the difference between Germany and the United States? Or I should probably say Germany and New York City, because different parts of the country had different responses. Were the differences that you saw down to national character, or were they down to something different when you got back to Germany?
So in Homo Empathicus, I also lay things out at point right at this question. If you live in a democracy that is empathy driven, then this democracy wants everybody and everyone to shine. To be able to shine, and that's a very liberal assessment, and also like liberal in Republican and democratic sense, is like we all have these talents, and we need to be able to like use these talents. Presidents from Reagan to Obama talked about this. So in such a society, in order to achieve that, you need free access to education and also free access or affordable access to healthcare. If you are like deprived of that, if you have to think, oh my God, if I'm sick, what am I gonna do? If I cannot go to school, that means also I will not have a good life afterwards in material terms, then of course you cannot live up to the promise of democracy. So, and in that sense, I'm very sad to report the obvious, that the United States fall pretty short on that record. And also, having lived in New York through the Black Lives Matter protests of last summer, it also shows another shortcoming of the United States. So clearly, if President Biden is not addressing those, he will continue the ruin of American democracy. The moment when he rolled back on his promise regarding student debt and minimum wage, it was for me like, oh my God, it's not about like party tactics or like to appease the Sanders camp or something. American democracy is lacking essentials that we do have in the rest of the democratic world. This is like when Adam Smith, the Scottish liberal economist, who was highly revered in the beginning of the American Republic. It was also read on the continent in Europe. And as you know, Great Britain and America have deployed another idea how they see economy and politics and society. But in Central Europe, in Germany, where Bismarck, by far not a leftist, was like seeing like how the inequality that capitalism can deploy, how they play out in society. He introduced insurance, health insurance, insurance against accidents and whatnot, in order to like soften the hardship that capitalism can have and can show. And that's the main difference still today between the United States and all other democracies in the world that I know. And America desperately has to work on these issues, and not just only like window dressing, but just really essentially.
Yeah, that's great. So I want to get into that. So you mentioned one very important, tangible thing that the United States can do: guarantee healthcare for its citizens. And I think that's a goal that we should work for. I'm not even saying that as a political point, that's just a human point. What else needs to be done to make American democracy more empathetic and really, you say that there are big differences between the democracy in the United States and democracy in Europe and other places. So what, we talked about healthcare, what else needs to be done to repair American democracy?
Well, I feel like healthcare and affordable schooling and university is already like a big task. As I just mentioned, the now president did step back from his campaign promises regarding those two. So I feel like that's still like an issue we need to be talking about. And it's just like that's already enough. I mean, you have many other problems when it comes to gerrymandering, like the electoral districts, like a thing that is continuing. Like after the vote for women was introduced in the United States, and they tried hard for women of color not to be able to vote. You also see like this is the Republican suit is more than the Democrats, I believe, but still, they alone the idea to be able to gerrymander and thereby impose or inflict on the election results is already a thing that should not be happening in a real democracy. However, And there was recently, I refer to the recent meeting between Chinese officials and American officials, when the Chinese side felt compelled to let the American side know about the shortcomings of their democracy, which I feel were not like wrong to be mentioned. Foreign Minister Blinken said something with very steady and absolutely correct, in my opinion. The shortcomings of democracy are in bright daylight in the United States, and they are widely discussed. And if you discuss them, you do not end up in prison. Or if you are a doctor who discovers a deadly virus, you are not be shot by the police and die. This is something that will not happen in the United States. And that means like that America, that a bad democracy is still better than like a well-run autocracy like China. So that's something like that's what I'm saying. It's like you have really like some severe points to work on. And I feel healthcare and education are the most profound ones. But having said that, America also has the strength within its population and within its institutions and with its history and narrative of freedom and democracy to actually achieve that goal. Whereas like countries like China that are run like on the fear of its populace, they are of course not be able to find like constructive criticism and like having things discussed in bright daylight open source.
Yeah, so I want to talk about China a little bit. You wrote an article, I think it was a couple months ago in DW, titled "China is Capitalizing on the COVID Crisis." So you just had some criticisms of China, but how are they capitalizing on the COVID crisis? What did you mean by that, and what did you say in that article?
Yeah, of course. I mean, there has been like China has deployed first masks and other medical garments and equipment, and it's now been like distributing vaccines. So that's basically what I was saying, and that's that in itself is of course not a problem. Also, the Vatican sent out face masks, so that's like part of like, and now the United States also give out vaccine doses. The point is just like that's not the only way how China is trying to capitalize and have influence in the world. The Belt and Road Initiative is a grand approach to influence foreign policy throughout the planet. And the whole, like many of these infrastructure projects that are funded by loans by the People's Republic of China are not being given. These loans are not being given according to an economic metric and how certain it is or not that the loan will be paid back, but rather also with an overarching political and geostrategical interest. And that is something that where you can say like China is trying step by step on many levels to expand its political influence. The difference, however, to a legitimate way of doing this is that China, I don't know where to start, the infringement on democracy in Hong Kong, the breaking of contracts with Hong Kong, the daily infringements on other contracts, trade contracts and patents, and you have Xinjiang, where you have 1 million people like being incarcerated in concentration camps. You have horrible stories. So this ethno-nationalism that's now deployed by this new dictator, like in Beijing, who made his name and his idea of a socialism of Chinese with Chinese characteristics being enshrined in the Chinese constitution. This is where the whole country or the policy of this country goes totally astray. And you cannot just let such a country exercise diplomatic efforts unchallenged.
Yeah, I think we talked about this 2 years ago. I had a very similar conversation, and unfortunately, things haven't changed. They've probably gotten worse in a lot of respects with regards to China and human rights, at least from certain perspectives.
But if I may say this, it also just made clearer how important it is that this League of Democracy really comes about and also defines its goal, its theory, its ideology, its beliefs, however you want to call it, and then formulate policies and then address these policies in the body, let's say, of the United Nations, or directly towards like the countries they want to deal with. I mean, you see like how anachronistic the world has become. Australia criticizing China being punished one-sidedly, and their goods will just be rotting in the harbor of Shanghai. At the same time, in November last year, there is a new free trade arrangement where Australia is with the China signatory. So this cannot go on forever. This is so much disconnect in the brain that you that you have to, and this is already happening, connect trade issues, economic issues with human rights issues, environmental issues, workers' protections issues, and so on and so on. And you see the recent thing going on in China, just boycotting brands who say, hey, you know what, we don't want to have like forced labor, wool and cotton in our product. They just say, whoa, you infringe on the freedom of the people of Xinjiang to be like oppressed and being put in concentration camps and work for us. So that's the logic behind it. So you see, we cannot afford much longer to not come to terms with what the autocracies, and China is just one of them. There's Russia, Turkey, there is the Philippines, so there's Brazil. In the European Union, we have with Poland and Hungary, 2 countries who do not actually belong any longer to this union. When they were like made like every other member to sign the Rechtsstaatsmechanismus, the mechanism of the rule of law kind of thing. This is a German long word, I don't know how to translate this properly into English. They said, no, we are not going to do this. But it's like, but this is like the foundation of values we all rest on. So why you Polish and Hungarian government do not want to sign this? So you see like there is like plenty of countries that who need to be addressed, their policies need to be addressed. And as a last point, when we remember that Huntington wrote about the clash of civilizations and Fukuyama about the victory of liberal democracy, you'd say like none of them was like entirely right, but none was also like entirely wrong. We have again a bipolar world, which we see, which would like say like Huntington, no, you were not right. It's not 7 or however 11 like spheres that somehow cosmically balance themselves out in their interest for power. But you also have to say like that Fukuyama in a sense was right, that the appeal of democracy is unbroken. We have seen this in Thailand last year. There's several examples where people like Hong Kong is one of the examples, obviously, where people say if we have the choice between such authoritarianism presented by Xi Jinping or democracy, we want democracy. So, and this is like where action is needed because people still want democracy, but it's under pressure from autocratic states and governments.
So you're saying all these issues about China and things that need to be addressed. And I was glad to see some of this addressed in the meeting in Alaska between Secretary Blinken and his counterparts from China. But it occurs to me that we're still interconnected with China, with Brazil, with Turkey, with all of these all these nations that you mentioned. We have the Olympics coming up in China next year, obviously the UN, all these different economic entanglements. So not really much of a question, but what do we do in this situation? How can we, I assume that you think that something like what happened in Alaska is a good thing and that we need to keep confronting these nations when they do things that are against our values.
I mean, the thing is like, or the hope now is that there are still fields where we can work together, like environmental protection. I would hope so too. But I'm skeptic, because what I said earlier, if your policy is and your ideology is resentment driven, it's very hard, even if some maybe in the party would want that in China, it's very hard to then constructively work. If you label other countries, other religions, other peoples as your enemy, you might think this is a rhetoric sport, but that will affect the psyche of your country and also your psyche. And every autocratic society becomes paranoid over time. So you already have a surveillance state in China, as we all know. So like the point I want to make is the chance for constructive fields, isolated fields of policy becomes slimmer. I would hope it's not impossible, but I would wonder if that works. Having said that, at the same time, in the free world, also in the United States, but not only, you have hatred against people of Asian descent or who look Asian. This is obviously, you know what I mean? That's also resentment, and that's also like fueled by Donald Trump and his minions. And it used to be fueled by him, now he's out of office. But like the idea calling like the virus like the Kung flu or something is certainly not helping. And you know, when we saw this with the riots on the Capitol on January 6th and whatever, so we also have these forces within our democratic countries who try to destabilize them from within. So it's not only We cannot just only finger point to these other countries, to China all the time. I mean, that's the point they tried to make in Alaska, which Blinken rebuked, in my opinion, marvelously. But still, it remains as a fact that if you are an old woman of Chinese descent, you fear to be beaten up by some young thugs in Flushing or in Chinatown, Manhattan. It's not gonna. It's no. We have to address that too.
Definitely. So I guess the last thing I wanted to speak about, we could end the conversation with this. You wrote in the book about powerful images and how powerful images can be used. You talked about how the images of the migrant crisis in Europe was used by right-wing groups to fuel resentment. Well, after this year of the pandemic and maybe year of the George Floyd, 2020 is just going to be a landmark year for everyone. So what are the powerful images that you think will last from 2020?
At this time when the pandemic hit and we lived in New York, we would hardly leave the house in the first weeks. And then after, I feel like 4 weeks or something, we took our first bike ride into Manhattan from Long Island City, just over the bridge. And that was like some, horror future sci-fi dystopian movie. That's like the whole city was empty. Central Park was empty. Fifth Avenue, not a single car. We rode down with the bikes, like Fifth Avenue, St. Patrick's, the public library. It was insane. It was also like in a way like, insane. You will never forget it. It's remarkable in a sense. And I remember this one day, the Pope would like give a speech on St. Peter's Square in Rome or a prayer, and he would walk alone up these stone stairs or what it is, and where usually are thousands of people. There was no one. It was very frightening again, no? But also it had something to it. I can't really put my finger on it. So I feel these will be images of this last year, of the pandemic per se.
What will those images be used for? Will they, maybe thinking optimistically, will they be used to usher in an era of empathy, or will they be used by populists for some other means?
I mentioned one photo in this book, and it's Earthwise by the Apollo missions, the first photo from out of space of our sweet little tiny blue planet. And it motivated peace and environmental movements back then in the late 60s and beyond. It's been the first time humankind could see their home from outer space. And clearly the reaction was to say like, whoa, this is where we live. And around it is all black and dark. So why don't we just get our act together and just work together to make this this place remains a habitable place for the generations to come. And the pandemic now showed us how connected we are. In fact, like it also really doesn't matter where it originated. I mean, it's important for some questions, but like for what we now discuss, it doesn't. People travel the whole time, the whole planet, within their countries for work, outside the country for work, and so this is an event that proves that we need global governance, we need global empathy, and also now when it comes to the distribution of the vaccines, I can understand every country that says like we need to like also vaccinate our people, but we also need, I mean, at the same time, you should not forget that there are other people too. And I mean, this is the old question of cosmopolitanism, like how much do we help? It's clear we help, but how much do we help? It's also in the book now, like the different modes of, if you will, like of cosmopolitanism. And I feel that's the challenge of the hour we have to live up to make this event actually, in hindsight, not one where resentment prevailed, but where empathy prevailed.
Okay, Alexander Görlach, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me, Alex. It's been a pleasure as always.
It's been great. That was Dr. Alexander Görlach, Carnegie Council Senior Fellow and author of Homo Empathicus. For more from Dr. Görlach, including my previous podcast with him, please go to carnegiecouncil.org. Thanks for listening, and stay safe and healthy.